I'm Congressman Ted Lieu. I'm so honored all of you are participating in my first annual virtual youth town hall. I want to particularly thank the members of my Youth Advisory Council who have been instrumental this year in assisting me on legislation and providing recommendations and advice. I also want to thank my staff members who are on this call, Nico and Annie and Aurelia. And thank you so much, Aurelia, for being the lead on the Youth Advisory Council. I'm going to give an update on the legislation that Congress has done, and then give you my views on how we get out of this pandemic. And then I look forward to answering your questions. So Congress has passed 4 bills in near record time, and we recently introduced a 5th one. The first bill we passed provided billions of dollars of research trying to cure, either through vaccine or drug therapy. The second bill we passed provided that testing was going to be free for everyone. And we also put in provisions for food security, for meals for seniors, as well as those who take SNAP benefits. And then we also put in provisions for emergency and paid medical and sick leave. Third bill we passed was the CARE stimulus package, and that provided a lot of assistance to both families and businesses. We had direct stimulus checks going out to millions of American families. We also had small business loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. We gave over $340 billion to states and local cities. And we also gave billions of dollars to hospitals and hospital systems. And we put in money for testing. The fourth bill we passed was an interim relief measure that increased funding for the small business loans. We also put in $75 billion for hospitals, and then another $25 billion for testing. And then the fifth bill that we just introduced on Friday, and it passed the House, actually it was introduced earlier in the week, but it passed the House on Friday, is a second round of stimulus that has, again, stimulus checks going to American families. We also provide funds for states and local cities and school districts, as well as additional money for testing in hospitals. And we also want to make sure that we can continue to give the economic injury disaster loans to small businesses. Now, so that's where we are in terms of legislation. And while Congress doesn't meet physically as much as before, we are working remotely. We are doing virtual hearings, and we recently voted in proxy voting, which means we can now vote remotely through proxy. And so this will make us much more nimble. We're in the 21st century. We have to be able to deal with this pandemic and operate remotely. And so I'm very pleased that those provisions were voted in this past week. Now, how we get out of this pandemic, I think there's 3 things we need to do. We have to do testing at scale. Then we have to do tracing and isolation. So we have to increase our testing to figure out who has the virus and where this virus is spreading. And then we have to trace anyone who's positive, the contacts that they engaged in the last 14 days. And then we have to get those people isolated so they don't continue spreading the virus. Other countries have done this. South Korea, for example, has done it quite well. And so if we can do that, then we can reopen America much more safely and get our economy going again. So with that, I want to thank again the Youth Advisory Council for everything you've done this year. And I'm going to hand it off to your president, Nate St. Germain, and look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you, Congressman. When I first joined the Youth Advisory Council during my sophomore year, I was looking for an outlet. I needed a place to further my passion for politics and be able to have a conversation with other students that share my interests. After spending 3 years on the council, I've met some of the brightest people I've ever known. I've had the incredible privilege to hear from the congressman and his staff about the valuable work he's doing, not just for the 33rd district, but for the country as a whole. And I was finally able to dive deeper into the issues that I care so much about. The time I've spent on the Youth Advisory Council has shown me the importance of civic virtue, or the dedication of citizens to the common welfare of their community. The students and young leaders of this council are dedicated to their community and won't stop until change occurs. This year, the council discussed and debated several key issues that affect our society during these tumultuous times. Council members researched and found bills to discuss topics from immigration to criminal justice reform. More than our meetings, however, the Youth Advisory Council is introducing more young adults to politics. 18 to 24-year-olds see the smallest rate of voter participation and turnout, but this council is taking immense strides in ending that trend. During our first meeting back in 2019, we laid some of the groundwork for this year, and today we have some council members to talk about our meetings and the issues that we discussed. Dylan Gohill will be talking about climate change, Serene Krovitz about housing and homelessness, Ali Lee about healthcare, Hallie McRae about gun violence prevention, Heather Holm about education, Ava Weinrod about immigration, and Luke Linella about criminal justice reform.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Gohill, and I'm a freshman at Crossroads School. For our second meeting, the Council discussed climate change, an issue that Congressman Lieu has been supporting since his first year in office. After the meeting, Congressman Lieu co-sponsored 5 of the bills and 1 resolution the Council suggested he co-sponsor. The first bill is H.R. 2349, the Climate Change Education Act. This bill requires that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration must establish a climate change education program. This program educates students around the country about human-induced climate change, including possible consequences and potential solutions. The next bill is H.R. 2164, the Green Bus Act 2019. This bill requires all buses purchased or leased to be zero emission beginning October 1st, 2029. The third bill is H.R. 4143, the Super Pollutants Act of 2019. This bill establishes a task force to review policies and measures to reduce climate pollutants. Next is H.R. 3969, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act of 2019. This bill addresses the plastic debris crisis threatening coastal economies and harming marine life. The fifth bill is H.R. 1317, the Coastal Communities Act Adaptation Act. This bill allocates funding for improved buildings and structures that account for extreme weather. The bill will also provide grant funding for coastal communities that need to adapt to the changing climate. Finally, Congressman Lieu co-sponsored House Resolution 15, expressing the commitment of Congress to the Paris Agreement. This resolution reaffirms Congress's commitment to the Paris Agreement to combat climate change and states that the United States is still in the agreement and should not withdraw. By supporting these bills, Congressman Lieu is working towards a better and cleaner future, environment, and planet for generations to come.
My name is Serene Krovitz, and I am a junior at Agora High School. Our October meeting was on housing and homelessness. This is a significant and relevant issue in the United States, with over 500,000 people going homeless on a single night. We discussed many pieces of legislation on this topic, and 5 of our recommended bills were co-sponsored by the congressman. H.R. 1724 is the Higher Education Access and Success for Homelessness and Foster Youth Act. This act would take important steps to improve the financial aid process for homeless and foster care youth. Through this act, more students experiencing homelessness and foster care would have access to higher education, which could allow them to break out of the cycle of poverty. This bill is important in securing those opportunities. H.R. 2924 is the Housing for Women Veterans Act. This would allocate grant money and more resources towards organizations that support female homelessness veterans and their families. This is a demographic that needs support, so this bill is extremely valuable. H.R. 3272 is the Services for Ending Long-Term Homelessness Act, which provides supportive services to individuals who are experiencing chronic homelessness. Many of these individuals have physical or mental health conditions or substance use disorders. By introducing permanent supportive housing, this act would address those problems that result in chronic homelessness. H.R. 4029 is the Tribal Access to Homelessness Assistance Act. This gives aid to fight homelessness within Native American tribes. This is especially significant since previous legislation excluded Native American tribes from receiving this aid, and these tribes often face high levels of poverty. Finally, H.R. 508 is the Trafficking Victims Housing Act of 2019, which would require a report to be created on the needs of victims of trafficking, including housing availability and other necessary services for those experiencing homelessness as a result of trafficking. This report would be valuable in providing necessary housing resources to trafficking victims. The Council recognizes that homelessness is a complex and diverse issue, which is why it's important to note that these bills not only address homelessness in general, but they also focus on the ways that homelessness and housing issues impact people differently in different demographics. If passed, these bills could have a really significant impact on individuals experiencing homelessness in the United States. That concludes our recap of the October meeting.
Hi everyone, my name is Allie Lee and I'm a senior at Calabasas High School. This past November, my peers and I had the opportunity to discuss healthcare, a legislative topic that is especially meaningful today. Our group reached the consensus that quality, affordable healthcare should be a right, not a privilege. We suggested legislation to the congressman that aims to strengthen the Affordable Care Act, from lowering the cost of prescription drugs to expanding access to healthcare, and Congressman Lieu generously co-sponsored the following bills. As the first generation to grow up surrounded by so much technology, my peers and I supported the Children and Media Research Advancement Act that would authorize an NIH study on the health and developmental effects of technology. We also recognize that due to the dangerous and often demanding nature of their profession, first responders retire before they are eligible for Medicare at the age of 65 in many cases. The Expanding Healthcare Options for Early Retirees Act would ease this work to retirement transition and ensure access to affordable healthcare coverage. In addition, our council supported the Competitive Health Insurance Reform Act because it would repeal antitrust exemptions for health insurance companies in favor of productive competition that fosters innovation and variety. We also recommended the Advancing Access to Precision Medicine Act, which endeavors to pilot test whether Medicaid coverage of genetic sequencing for children could help settle diagnostic challenges and improve clinical outcomes. It would direct the Department of Health and Human Services to study how genetic testing may improve health outcomes and how the federal government may reduce barriers to its use. Finally, my peers and I were surprised to learn that drug manufacturers in the US today are not required to disclose whether a medication contains gluten, leaving celiac patients often at risk. The Gluten in Medicine Disclosure Act would thankfully bridge this gap by amending the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to include gluten derivatives. And these are all the healthcare bills that the congressman generously co-sponsored based on our suggestions. And we think it's important for you guys to note that they all cover different aspects of healthcare, and hopefully these will eventually pass in the House. And next is Hallie with gun control and gun violence prevention.
Thank you, Allie. So yes, my name is Hallie McCrae, and I'm a senior at Palisades Charter High School. So our January topic in the Youth Advisory Council discussed this year was gun violence prevention, which Congressman Lieu is an avid supporter of. Especially being so prevalent in the lives of students today, the council had overall concurring opinions on the bills. The congressman accepted 2 of our recommendations on bills to co-sponsor, and the Youth Advisory Council even got a shout out on the House floor for our recommendation. First of the 2 bills is H.R. 1705, Jamie's Law. This bill was voted on unanimously by the council to support. It enhances the background check process by ensuring that those who are prohibited from purchasing firearms are unable to purchase ammunition as well. The council recognizes that anyone who's prohibited from purchasing a gun should not be able to purchase ammunition for the weapon, working as a way to close this significant loophole. The other bill co-sponsored by the congressman was H.R. 1266, the Ghost Guns Are Guns Act. This bill states that firearm assembly kits shall be considered firearms and be subject to the same restrictions as pre-assembled weapons. Currently, these ghost guns do not require manufacturers to have a federal license or to follow age restriction laws for their sale, serving as another significant loophole which puts the safety of the 33rd District and the nation in jeopardy. By supporting these bills, Congressman Lieu has supported working towards a safer district, safer communities, and all around a safer living environment for everyone. So that concludes our January topic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Holm, and I'm a junior at Viewpoint School. I'll be discussing the council and congressman's work regarding education, and as a council of high schoolers, issues surrounding this topic are highly relevant. We have successfully gotten 4 bills co-sponsored by the congressman, including H.R. 4584, the Financial Aid Fairness for Students Act, which repeals the suspension of eligibility for student aid due to drug-related offenses. This helps give students a second chance and addresses underlying systematic racism in existing law. HR 4220, the Chronic Absenteeism Reduction in Every School Act, which allows local educational agencies to use federal funds for programs and activities that address chronic absenteeism. HR 4680, the Equitable Student Aid Access Act, which creates a standardized language to simplify the financial aid application process. And finally, HR 4968, the BASIC Act, which seeks to provide basic needs for college students, such as food and housing. In general, the Council believes in increasing opportunities and simplifying the process for low-income students to receive financial aid. We also support wider access to and improvement of mental health services for high school and higher education students. That concludes our February meeting.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ava Weinrott, a freshman at Harvard Westlake School. Our March meeting was on the topic of immigration, a pressing and relevant topic in our nation. The first bill the Congressman co-sponsored was H.R. 1045. This bill directs the Department of Justice to establish an Office of Legal Access Programs within the Executive Office of Immigration Review. The office will develop and administer programs to educate detained aliens about their legal rights under U.S. immigration law. This bill will give vital legal knowledge to immigrants when they enter the country, helping make the immigration process more just and efficient. Another bill was H.R. 1078. This bill prohibits the deportation of and eases the citizenship process for certain U.S. veterans. Individuals who have been convicted of certain crimes, such as voluntary manslaughter, rape, or terrorism, are exempt from the protections outlined by this bill. This bill is important because individuals who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces and maintained an eligible legal record have a right to remain within the U.S. and should be granted easy access to naturalization. It is essential that we respect our veterans regardless of their citizenship and recognize the sacrifices that they have made for the sake of our country. H.R. 4718 is a bill that seeks to strengthen voter protections and help minimize disenfranchising of immigrant voters. Finally, H.R. 5734, the Neighbors Not Enemies Act, looks to repeal sections 4967 through 4070 of the revised statutes of the United States, also known as the Alien Enemies Act. The act repeals the ability of the sitting president to apprehend, restrain, and remove alien enemies when there is a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government. The Alien Enemies Act was the very piece of legislation that enabled President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to create Japanese internment camps during World War II. Aliens are defined as people who are natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government being of the age of 14 years and upward who are not naturalized. This bill is important because citizens of the United States should not be deported due to their heritage or family identity. These bills have the possibility of enacting meaningful change in our nation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luke Gellanella, and I am a freshman at Windward School. During our final meeting in April, focused on the highly important issue of criminal justice reform, conducted online via Zoom, the Youth Advisory Council supported 4 bills, all of which the Congressman has agreed to co-sponsor. The first of these bills is H.R. 3795, also known as the Second Look Act, which would allow any individual who has served at least 10 years in federal prison to petition a court to take a, quote, second look at their sentence before a judge and determine whether they are eligible for a sentence reduction or release. The second of which is H.R. 1950, also known as Sarah's Law, an incredibly important bill which would allow for federal judges to impose reduced sentencing for juvenile sex trafficking, abuse, and assault survivors who commit crimes against their abusers, and urge the justice system to keep these children in the juvenile or child welfare system for services or care. The third of these bills on criminal justice reform is H.R. 5053, also known as the Justice for Juveniles Act, which would help protect young people from abuse by making it easier for them to seek help from the government and other resources. The fourth and final of these bills on criminal justice reform is H.R. 915, also known as the Expanded Stalking Protections Act of 2019, which would expand protections of friends and coworkers under federal regulations and laws on stalking, and will expand the realm of conduct that constitutes a stalking offense to include the reasonable belief of danger by a friend or coworker. The entire Youth Advisory Council is incredibly proud to have all 4 of these bills on the important issue of criminal justice reform co-sponsored by the Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more presentations? Terrific. Thank you so much. Really appreciate, again, all your hard work and for giving so much advice and insights to me and to my staff. That's really, really appreciated. I think we now have some questions and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
All right, cool. Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a junior at South. And the first question is, how have the Youth Advisory Council and other student outreach programs impacted your policymaking?
Thank you, Luke, for your question. So just so you know, after your meetings, I get a lengthy write-up from Aurelia about what happened in the meeting and the recommendations that you all put in, and I read that memo and it informs both me and my staff. And that's why you see that many of your recommendations, I end up co-sponsoring that legislation. So I want to explain a little bit about what it's like to be in Congress. We're in 2-year legislative cycles, and I vote over 1,000 times every 2 years. And on most of those bills, I'd say over 80%, I don't get a single phone call, email, fax, meeting. So when I get a memo that says, hey, you should look at these bills, then that does make a difference and affects me and my staff, and it causes us to look into the issues much more closely. And that's been extraordinarily helpful. So I'm very thankful for the Youth Advisory Council and for all the hard work that all of you put in.
Hi, my name is Sarah Rakim, and I'm a senior at Buckley. The second question is, how are you helping address educational concerns due to COVID-19, and what can students expect regarding educational policies for the next school year?
Thank you, Sarah, for your question. As some of you may know, my wife, Betty, was elected to Torrance School Board. And so I've been able to see firsthand the challenges of the school district. Torrance itself is pretty diverse and pretty big. So you've got folks who are doing well, and you have folks who are not doing well. And so making sure that every student has access not only to technology, whether it's laptops or some sort of mobile device to access online coursework, but also to have Wi-Fi or at least some sort of internet service that is reliable. And so trying to make sure that that happens is something that we're realizing is a pretty big deal now in this pandemic. We have to make sure we get broadband everywhere. So I'm supporting, actually last term I introduced legislation for infrastructure package that would get broadband everywhere, including rural areas as well as areas in urban places where we still don't have broadband. So I think it's very important that we make sure that all American families have access to broadband as well as technology, because so much of what we do now is, in terms of learning, going to be done remotely and online. Now, hopefully, we'll get some cure or some drug therapy, or we'll have enough of the virus getting suppressed that we can start in-person classes in the fall. If we're unable to do that, then we're going to have to continue to do classes online.
Hello, my name is Siaji, and our next question is, how has COVID-19 kind of shifted the role that science plays in policymaking? And have you seen a change in the way that lawmakers are viewing the importance of science?
So what we've seen is actually fairly remarkable compliance on the overwhelming majority of American people to all these stay-at-home and lockdown orders. And that's based largely on science and a trust in our public health officials and in doctors. So I feel generally pretty good that the overwhelming majority of Americans do trust science, they trust the medical advice, and their first priority is to protect themselves and that of their loved ones. You do see a minority of Americans who are protesting and don't wear masks and sort of think this virus is a hoax or don't think it's a big deal. But that's a very small minority. And poll after poll still shows that the overwhelming majority of Americans understand that this virus is a big deal and that they don't want to contract it and that they place public health as a number one priority.
Hi, my name is Rohan, and I'm a junior at Chadwick School. Next question: what's being done to ensure the health and well-being of the homeless during this time?
Thank you for that question. So I'm very pleased that in this last bill that we passed off the House floor, one of my bills was put into it and it passed, and it was a bill that authorized the VA to serve meals to homeless veterans. And so we need to do all we can to help homeless veterans and make sure they get the services they need. And then in terms of homeless, the homeless population in general, the federal government has largely had jurisdiction over veterans who are homeless. But just because that's the way it is, doesn't mean it's the way it has to be. And so Senator Feinstein and I have introduced legislation that will provide nearly $4 billion to local cities and counties over 5 years to address the homeless population, whether or not they are veterans. And I think we need to make sure that we give the resources to the local cities and counties who are at the front lines of dealing with the homelessness issue. Hopefully we can get that through Congress as well.
Hi, my name is Xander Kane, and I'm a junior at El Segundo High School. And my question is, given our political climate preceding and during the COVID-19 crisis, how important do you think it is to reach across the aisle to form bipartisanship?
So what you're seeing with this crisis is an unprecedented level of cooperation between federal, state, and local officials, as well as with businesses and nonprofits, and really see a lot of members of society working together, trying to find a cure, trying to make sure that we support each other. And then in terms of bipartisanship, the first 4 laws that Congress passed were bipartisan. This 5th one, we did have Republican member Peter King out of New York who voted for it. We're hoping to get more bipartisan support. The original CARES Act did not start out bipartisan. It was actually a fairly partisan bill, but then through negotiations, it became bipartisan and it had overwhelming bipartisan support. So we look forward to HEROES Act, this 5th bill that we did that passed the House. We hope that becomes more bipartisan as well. And what you do see is people working together. And at the end of the day, my view is we're all Americans, and by working together, that's how we prevail.
Hello, Congressman Lieu. My name is Emily Renner, and I'm from Palos Verdes High School. And my question is, how do you anticipate this virus will impact how the government runs going forward? And do you think that sessions of Congress will be altered, and will technology play a larger role with how meetings are conducted?
Thank you, Emmy, for that question. I'm a recovering computer science major, so I've long been advocating that we should move Congress into the 21st century. I'm pleased that on Friday, the House passed rule changes that gets us closer to being in the 21st century in terms of how we operate. So we now have authorized remote hearings, so hearings that we can do virtually and that we can do without having to physically meet. I think that's important during a pandemic. We also authorize proxy voting, which would allow Congress to continue pass legislation off the floor of the House without requiring all 435 members to be there. And we're also exploring additional rule changes to make Congress even more nimble during this pandemic. But I think what we're seeing is Congress taking steps to operate remotely. And my view is, since we're telling Americans to work from home if possible, Congress should also lead by example.
Hi, Congressman. I'm Sam. What advice would you give to students interested in possibly careers in politics and lawmaking? And how can students begin to be politically active and involved now, especially during quarantine when it's a lot harder to organize?
Thank you for those two questions. Yes, it is. I'll take the second one first. It is harder to organize. Um, so what we're trying to do is to try to do things remotely through your mobile phone or through computers. For example, my district office and Capitol office do remain open. They're not physically open, but all our staff is working remotely, and we're still dealing with constituent issues and handling legislation. So we've all learned to work remotely. And in terms of organizing, it's a brand new world now where we have to learn to organize through phone calls, text messages, through apps, social media. And so everyone is learning to do that more. And then for your first question, being a member of Youth Advisory Council is helpful to that. It's a good start. Many cities have local commissions as well, including youth commissions. So you may want to look at engaging in that. And then in terms of in the future, if anyone's interested in elected office or political appointment, let me know. And if you're qualified, I will assist you. Everyone on this council obviously is qualified, so let me know and I will help you. You may also want to ask yourself, why is it that you want to be in government? And if you have a good answer for that, then you should absolutely pursue that. My view is that all of you should pursue your dreams. As far as I can tell, you only live once. And if you don't pursue your dream in this lifetime, there is no other lifetime in which to do it. So whatever that dream is, I think you should pursue it and see what happens. Nate, do we have any other questions?
I think some council members have other questions that they've prepared to ask you.
Okay.
So if you have any you would like to share, just feel free to shout out.
Hi again, this is Hallie from Palisades Charter High School. So one question I have is, what measures are being introduced to ensure adequate resources to provide for the emotional well-being of all students across Los Angeles and the 33rd District, either online or in person, to address mental health needs?
Thank you, Hallie. That's a great question. When I was in the California legislature, I supported and voted for a large increase in funding for mental health when I was in the state Senate. I think mental health is one of the issues that is perpetually underfunded. And so we need to make sure that we continue to fund mental health at the levels it needs to be. A lot of it is state funding related. And so I'm hopeful that our state legislature will continue to have mental health funding. I think we also have to have society view mental health just like physical health and no longer have a stigma put around it. With every passing year, I think society is more and more open to mental health and how people view it. But I think there's still, unfortunately, a stigma attached to it. And one day I would like people to view mental health the same as physical health. And so we can then better deliver those services. In terms of at the national level, I've been very supportive of increase of mental health funding. But again, most of it does happen at the state level, as well as counties.
Thank you.
Hi, Congressman. I'm Nate. I'm from Miracosta High School. How important do you think it is for the media to portray this virus using science and facts in order to give people the correct information about what this virus actually is?
Most of the media has generally been pretty good in terms of accurately describing this virus. You've seen a number of stories about how contagious this virus is, about the number of cases we have in the United States, the number of deaths. Unfortunately, we've now exceeded over 90,000 deaths in America in less than 3 months from COVID-19. So this is a very contagious virus, and for some people, it is lethal. For people who contract it, we also know that even if it doesn't kill you, about 15 or so percent of the people get so sick they have trouble breathing, or they have organ damage, or they have other conditions that make them go to the hospital and get treated. And so this is really a virus that no one wants to get. And that's why poll after poll shows that Americans put public health as a #1 priority. And they're actually much more concerned about a rush to reopen rather than if we reopen later. And so I think it's important that as we reopen, we do it safely and do it based on science. Unfortunately, we do have a president that it's not clear to me how much he pays attention to science. What we see is that his own administration will set out guidelines to states on how they should reopen in phases 1, 2, and 3. And then, even though the states haven't met the conditions that his administration has set, he will then go ahead and egg on protesters to protest the governors are following his very own guidelines. That's a ridiculous way to govern. It's confusing the American people. And so it is my hope that the president sticks to science rather than whatever he happens to be thinking at any given moment. So we'll see if he does better in the next few weeks.
How do you think that the public can become active in fighting against the effects of COVID-19? And specifically, what can students do to become active in promoting awareness and safety in this time?
So I think, again, it's important to rely on medicine and on science and on facts. You should all know that anecdotes does not equal data. And so there were some anecdotes at the beginning, for example, that showed the anti-malarial medication hydroxychloroquine was thought to have had some good effects on COVID-19 patients. Large-scale studies showed that was not the case. It, in fact, did not work on COVID-19 patients. Some studies actually showed it caused more deaths. So one reason anecdotes does not equal data in the COVID-19 situation is the very simple fact that most people who get COVID-19 will recover. So you could, for example, give them Snickers bars or grapes or cough drops and likely achieve the exact same result as if you gave them hydroxychloroquine. And so what these large-scale studies showed is when you gave them hydroxychloroquine and then you actually had a control group and you looked at it, there was really no effect of the anti-malarial medication. It also turns out that that medication has some pretty severe side effects, especially for people who have cardiac conditions. It could be lethal for people who have certain heart conditions. So again, it's very damaging if people like the president does not rely on facts. Now, people can push back on that. And because scientists and doctors and a lot of people across America started pushing back on that, you saw that we fortunately don't have a lot of people now ingesting hydroxychloroquine for no reason. And one thing that young people can do is, again, continue to rely on facts and science, and then use social media to promote facts instead of promoting conspiracy theories. I think it's also pretty clear that COVID-19 does have a disproportionate effect on people who are older. For whatever reason, it seems to affect young people less. However, this is a still fairly new virus we don't know a lot about. So we have seen additional articles that it turns out that this inflammatory syndrome that is rare has all of a sudden started spiking and appeared in a lot of children in New York and in Italy and some other places. And so I encourage you to take a look at some of those articles because we're still not exactly clear as to why that's been happening among a certain subgroup of young people. And we also don't quite know how this virus transmits through young people. Is it possible, for example, for someone to go to school, contract a virus, and then give it to their grandmother? Or is that a very rare occurrence? I think that's something we need to figure out. And so we'd have to rely again on science and data to figure that out.
This is Serene from Agora High School. In what ways do you foresee the virus impacting the 2020 election and elections in the future in terms of vote by mail and other changes?
Thank you for that question. I support vote by mail because I think it's a safer alternative to voting. In terms of whether it benefits one particular party or the other, I think it's unclear. It's historically, vote by mail actually tends to benefit Republicans. So if it was done large scale, it's not clear exactly what would happen. I think no one actually knows until it's actually tried. But I do support vote by mail because it is a safer alternative for people to vote while we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the CARES Act has money put in there to help states transition to vote by mail. This HEROES Act that we just passed also has money that passed the House, also has money for states to transition to vote by mail.
This question comes from a senior at Miracosta High School. Do you think that amateur sports, such as rec leagues, can return in the near future?
That's a good question. So I'm not a doctor or public health official. I think it may depend on the sport. I think, for example, a sport with prolonged close personal contact might not happen until we get a cure or drug therapy. So wrestling, for example, might not be the first sport that starts up, but golf might start up pretty soon. You can socially distance while playing golf. Tennis, you could largely socially distance while playing tennis. So I think people are thinking through the different sports to see which ones could start sooner rather than later. And again, this virus is still fairly new. It's only been around for a few months, and scientists and virologists are learning new things about it with every passing week. And as more is learned about it, I think it'll inform us as to what sports or other activities we can safely start to reopen.
I know a lot of other Western countries have been providing more direct payments to their citizens. So I was wondering if there is any movement in the House to pass more direct payments to Americans.
The CARES Act had direct stimulus funds to American families. It also extended unemployment insurance for 4 months and gave an additional $600 per week for 4 months. So the HEROES Act that passed the House extends unemployment insurance till next January and also has an additional round of stimulus payments. So Congress is still, at least the House is, trying to continue with what the CARES Act did.
Hi, Congressman. I was wondering if you see COVID-19 affecting our system long term, especially in terms of universal health care or free housing.
Thank you for that question. So in terms of universal health care, it has definitely elevated the issue of health care in the minds of Americans. Regardless of what you think of Medicare for all, the fact that now, according to a recent poll, over 44% of Republicans support Medicare for all is pretty astounding. And so what you're seeing is a lot more people across both sides of the aisle supporting universal health care. And we know that in terms of job losses, one of the first things that people lose with their job loss is healthcare coverage. It's one reason that the HEROES Act has provisions in there to allow for re-enrollment in the Affordable Care Act, as well as provisions to subsidize COBRA. So we are working in Congress to try to increase healthcare coverage, but I think across society, it's also elevated that issue in people's minds, and a lot more people support universal health care. What's the second topic that you mentioned?
Housing for the homeless.
Oh, in terms of housing. So I think that's somewhat depends on what state you live in and what city you live in. Some states and cities have very little homelessness issues. Some are grappling with the issue because it started spiking. So not clear to me that this pandemic has altered a lot of people's minds on that issue, because it's been relatively uneven across the United States in terms of how people perceive homelessness. But in California, it's definitely made an impact where we realize that homelessness is a huge problem, because not only are they homeless, but they also don't get access to information the same way that you and I do. And how do you make sure that they know that they should wear masks, and that they should socially distance, and that this virus could be lethal to them? So it is a very big problem, and that's why I think we need to continue to increase resources to states and cities and local governments to address the homelessness issue.
How do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic will affect our educational systems and institutions in the long term as well, and how they operate?
That's a great question. So clearly, it's put a lot of pressure on remote learning and distance learning, and to make sure that school districts have the technology available for students, not just at school, but in their homes, to be able to do this. And so you do see a lot of school districts investing and buying technology, which is good. And that's good for a long term. It is also something that teachers have had to now learn and do, right? No one is born being a remote distance educator. You have to learn those skills, you have to learn the technology. And so now we have a whole generation of teachers that are being trained on how to deliver remote learning and how to do it effectively. So those are all good things going forward. We also see that there are kids who have been on free and reduced student lunches that during this pandemic, obviously they're not physically going to school, so they can't access it. So a number of school districts now have set up sites where families can go and pick up food for their children. And so you've seen school districts have to adjust. And this is all helpful for any future disasters or future pandemics. Hopefully, we won't get another pandemic like this in 50 years or more, but it could also happen in 5 years. We just don't know. So having school districts learn the lessons now is very helpful for any future disasters or pandemics.
Hi, this is kind of in tangent to Luke's question, but my question is that going forward after the coronavirus, how will we better prepare our country, economy, and government for a pandemic in the future? And will the pandemic response team that was fired by the president in 2018 be reinstated?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I don't think any future president's going to fire the pandemic response team ever again. It's also important, I think, whenever you transition to a new president, whether it's this November or 4 years from now, that the new administration pays attention to what the prior administration left them. So the Obama administration left them a very well thought out pandemic playbook on how to respond to pandemics. And unfortunately, the current administration appeared to have ignored that. We also have to make sure that we have the domestic manufacturing capability to address future pandemics. Who would have thought that what we needed now to save American lives were not bulletproof vests or better armor or better missiles or better tanks? It was actually masks that we needed, and gowns and face shields and personal protective equipment. So we need to make sure we have a domestic manufacturing capability to address the personal protective equipment issue in the future, instead of having to rely on other countries and never again have a shortage of PPE. And I think that was a hard lesson that we learned. And it's something that I know that everyone in Congress is very aware of. And so for future pandemics, we need to make sure we have not only the domestic manufacturing ability, but also make sure that our national stockpiles actually have the equipment necessary to deal with any potential viral or other outbreaks in the future.
Hi, I have another question about COVID-19. I was wondering, what is the role of the international institutions in combating the virus? And if you could please elaborate on the president's recent considerations to withhold funding from the World Health Organization. Thank you.
So I disagree with the president's, I want to say action to withhold funding, but it's not clear to me he could actually do that. We think it's illegal. The Democrats in Congress believe he doesn't actually have that authority. So it's not clear to me it's actually going to happen. So we're investigating that. In any event, he has said that he intends to do that, and I oppose that. The World Health Organization is important because COVID-19 is a threat to the United States as long as it remains a threat in any country because of the simple fact of air travel and global travel. And migration. And so if you have COVID-19 in Canada, for example, that's going to be a problem. If you have COVID-19 in Nigeria or in South Korea or wherever it is, it's still going to be a problem. And the World Health Organization is very helpful worldwide in many of these countries to try to provide information, to educate, and to take actions to try to reduce the spread of the virus. So I think it's actually rather insane for the president to try to cut funding to the World Health Organization. At the same time, I've been pushing for the World Health Organization to be more inclusive. I think it is unfortunate that they have not allowed Taiwan as an observer in the World Health Organization. As some of you may know, Taiwan got this right at the very beginning. They said that COVID-19 could be transmitted between humans. They said that very early on. They contradicted China at the time. And Taiwan still has so far been able to suppress this virus quite well in an area that has a lot of people close together. And so I've been pushing for the WHO to include Taiwan. And recently, the head of WHO has in fact made a proposal to do that. So I'm pleased. And so hopefully that's going to happen. So I'm fully supportive of the WHO, and I look forward to fighting against the president's proposed action to cut funding to it.
All right. Hi, it's Luke again from South High. There's been some talk about COVID possibly rearranging global supply chains, like in America, having less manufacturing reliance on other countries. Do you see this happening? And if so, what are your thoughts?
I think it's going to alter the supply chain for personal protective equipment and for potentially some other medical equipment. I don't think it will largely affect global supply chains for most other products. It's also, I think, shown how we could have some issues with certain kinds of food. So we don't have a shortage of food. But what you will see is potentially some spikes in certain kinds of food. For example, if a bunch of food processing plants go down because of the virus, because the workers are all getting sick, you might see chicken prices rise or beef prices rise and so on. And so I think there's some thinking going to how can we make these plants more resilient. I led a letter with members of Congress to try to increase funding to what's known as the Farm to Food Bank program. In California, it's called the Food to Family program. And what it does is it takes surplus food from farms and delivers them to food banks and other nonprofit organizations to get those to people who are hungry and or food insecure, because otherwise you read these stories about the farmers having to destroy their food because they can't get it out to these food processors, get them processed. And to me, it's sort of senseless to destroy food when there's so many people are going hungry. So in terms of supply chain, I think it depends on the exact product or item that's in question. So I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap this up.
Hi, Congressman. A question that I had was, what are you optimistic about in terms of COVID-19 research?
So in terms of research, we did see today a promising phase 1 trial for a vaccine from the company known as Moderna. So that's good. Now it's also only phase 1. They still have to go to phase 2 and phase 3, but at least that's promising. We've seen some good research out of Oxford. We've seen some good results coming from other institutions. And so you've got the best and brightest minds, not just in the United States, but all over the world, working on this problem. And so I'm hopeful we'll get a vaccine sooner rather than later. It's still going to be a challenge because with vaccines, at some point, there's only so much you can speed it up because you, for example, want to know, hey, will this vaccine kill someone in 30 days? Well, you won't really know that because you have to wait 30 days, right? So there's just some things you can't actually speed up during these vaccine trials. And so it's just going to take some time. And then the other obstacles, you have to make these vaccines very, very quickly on a mass scale. And so that also takes some time to do. But I'm hopeful we're going to get one sooner rather than later. If we can get one by early next year, that'd be remarkable, but I think durable. So we'll see. In the meantime, if we can get some drug therapies to mitigate the effects of COVID-19, that would also be very helpful. So we know that remdesivir has shown to have some good effects. It shortened hospital stays on average from 15 days to 11 days, which is positive. And so as they do additional trials, we can see if that also has an effect on keeping people from dying. That would be extremely helpful if it also could mitigate that effect. We've seen some research out of Hong Kong that showed a 3-drug antiviral therapy seemed to have some good effects as well. So with every passing week, we learn more about this virus, about new therapies. And that's why it's so important to make sure we flatten the curve, that we don't continue to spread this virus unnecessarily, that we work from home if possible, because it all buys us time. And with time, we get to know more about the virus. We get to see if additional drug therapies have a good effect, and we get closer to a vaccine. Think how unfortunate it would be if someone contracted the virus today and died, would have lived 6 months later had they only gotten it 6 months later because a drug therapy started working then. So that's why it's so important, I think, that we continue to listen to our public health officials and to continue doing what we can to mitigate the spread of this virus.
And for our last question, what have you been during free time over quarantine, and what do you recommend for the people at home to do?
So Congress is still working remotely. So I've been on a lot of conference calls and Zoom calls and WebEx calls dealing with legislation. We're still working on legislation. We're passing legislation, introducing bills. And so I'm still doing the work of the people. In addition, my staff, both in district office and Capitol office, continue to work remotely, and we're still dealing with a flood of constituent requests because these laws have generated a lot of different agency actions. And if people are not, for example, getting the stimulus checks or having trouble getting a paycheck protection loan, they can contact my office and we will assist them. So that work continues. In the evenings, I will try to binge watch some series. So my wife and I and my family recently finished season 2 of Jack Ryan. So I just want to say that Jack Ryan sets the standard for legislative aides, because that's what he is in season 2. If any of you have any good ideas for series or films you think we should watch in the evening, please let my staff know, and I'll take a look into it.
Thank you, Congressman.
So thank you again for participating in this first annual virtual youth town hall. I really appreciate your hard work on the Youth Advisory Council, and I also really appreciate everyone participating today and your very insightful questions. And then I'm going to have Aurelia simply explain a little bit on how to apply for Youth Advisory Council for next year.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aurelia Friedman. I am a field representative for Congressman Ted Lieu. I also oversee the Youth Advisory Council for the past couple years. I just wanted to give everybody some information about how you can apply for the Youth Advisory Council. So there's a page on our website under Helping You. So under that tab, lieu.house.gov, and then you'll find the Youth Advisory Council. There is some information on there that you'll need to complete if you're interested in joining us for next year. You'll be sending an email with all the information to my email, which is AURELIA.FRIEDMAN @mail.house.gov. That information includes your consent form and application form that will need to be filled out, and you can email those forms directly to me. You'll need a few letters of recommendation, and those recommenders can send those emails to me directly, or you can CC them to me. We'll need a copy of your transcript and an essay about why you're interested in the Youth Advisory Council and what you can bring to the table and what your policy areas of interest are. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. You can call our district office at 323-651-1040, or you can send me an email. It's all on the website.
Thank you, Aurelia, and thank you again, everyone, for participating, and stay safe out there. Have a good day.